Okay, so for this presentation, I'm going to be discussing William Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. These are my wrap-up notes, so this is not a full lecture or full analysis of this poem, but just to outline the broad categories, some of the themes which could certainly use further inquiry. This is one of my favorite poems. I was introduced to this poem many, many decades ago, and I return to it occasionally, and I just think it's a fantastic poem. It's one of the important poems of Romantic literature. It was published in 1798 in Lyrical Ballads, the collection of poetry between William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this is not an exhaustive list, and these categories are not exclusive of one another. They can be reordered in various ways, so certain things could be subcategories of others, all depending on how you might do so, all depending on how you might be constructing an argument. This is a fairly short poem. It's really a couple of pages long, and again, I find this just a fantastic poem in a variety of different ways, and some of them we're going to explore here just briefly. So what is this poem about? Some broad categories. Well, the relationship of the past and the present and of memory. And to give you some examples of this in the poem in lines 1 through 5. 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. So the poem starts off, if you recall, that the speaker has been away from this place for 5 years and has returned to it. And think about what your experience is like when you have a fond memory, or you have a fond memory of a place and you've been absent from it for 5 years. That sets the sort of context of the speaker. The speaker has been in nature near this ruined Abbey. He has been gone from it for 5 years and has come back. What has happened in 5 years? The speaker has matured. Life has moved on. So the place of the previous memory may have a different significance, or its significance, it might have changed. It might be the same. So those are things that we have to consider in this poem. And I also want to bring our attention to line 90, line 83. And this is where I think in the poem shifts. So the speaker has been gone from this place for 5 years. There's contemplation, a meditation of a variety of different things. And around line 83, something changes. On line 83, that time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. So this is a poem about memory. It's about the past. It's about how the past has an influence in the present moment. And the speaker gets to this line 83, and all of these contemplations, all of these meditations, he says, this is all gone now. That's all in the past. Here is where we are now, and these are my current reflections on this particular moment. Friendship and companionship. And these are not in any, let me also qualify this, that these are not in any particular order. Friendship and companionship, we can look on lines beginning with 115. Of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. And then on line 150, that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together. So, again, the poem has to do with friendship in some ways. Who is the friend? Who is the we? And I think there are a variety of ways of considering this. William Wordsworth lived with his sister in the cottage region. Um, and was this poem being addressed to his sister? His sister could be his friend in that way. Absolutely. Could the friend be a manifestation of his own psyche? That when he says, dear friend, he is addressing himself, a kind of Platonic dialogue with himself to wrestle out these physical and metaphysical ideas, his unhappiness, and all of those sorts of things. That is also a possibility. And I would add a third possibility, that dear friend is addressing us, you, the reader, that by reading this poem we are entering within the circle of intimacy to hear these very sort of deep, intimate feelings and meditations that the speaker is espousing. Okay, this is a poem about nature. Nature operates in all sorts of different ways as an object of beauty for contemplation in relation to the city, as a construct of imagination, as being something sublime. And something sublime, and there's a philosophical tradition explicating what sublime is. But I would suggest to us that, and I brought this up, and I think in one of my earlier videos pertaining to romanticism, the sublime is this overwhelming sense of beauty. In many ways, it's full of terror. It's crushing. That you are small in the face of the gigantic canvas of nature. And I think that is a part of this poem as well. Some all sorts of images of nature in this poem. Let me draw our attention to beginning with line 5. That on a wild, secluded scene. Let me back up a moment. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs, that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. Okay, so I think there are a lot of different things happening here. We have sky, so something, a geographic space above us. We have the landscape, which is out before us, before the speaker. And we also have the speaker himself situated in this scene. These cliffs are lofty, they're large, they're overwhelming. They impress thoughts of a more deep seclusion. What are these thoughts of a more deep seclusion? It's not just that the speaker here is looking upon nature and saying, oh, it's very calming, it's tranquil, it's beautiful. All of those things I think are important about nature. And I think that does operate in this poem to some degree. But nature also is a symbol for the things going on inside of the speaker. Deep seclusion, the recesses of the human mind, the recesses of the human heart. Okay, view of the world. There are oppositions, often binary oppositions in this poem, and one of those oppositions has to do with the city in one space and nature in another space. And if we can look at, for instance, line 50, and there's all sorts of examples of the speaker's feeling about the city and how this may influence his retreat into nature. Line 50, 49, beginning with 49. If this be but a vain belief, yet oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee. Okay, so what is the city in this poem? The city has a joyless daylight. There's no joy in the city. What does it mean to be fretful? I think fretful is maybe uptight, anxious, nervous, right? I mean, when that alarm clock goes off in the morning, Maybe some of us get a sense of anxiety because you have to get to work, you have to get to school, you have to start your day, and your Monday is like Tuesday, and it's like Wednesday, and it's like Saturday, and repeat over and over and over again. That, I think, is fretful. There is a fever of the world. What is a fever? What is a fever an indication of? Illness. So the city is described in these pejorative terms on one side, and this then becomes the justification and the desire for the speaker to enter into a place that he had once been before, in the realm of nature around this ruined abbey. Physical and metaphysical. What is all of this about? Well, we're talking about some pretty, to use the language of Wordsworth, some pretty lofty things. And sometimes when we're talking about things that are enigmatic, mysterious, complicated, we might call those things metaphysical. They are not of the physical world. They become, in themselves, I think, almost overwhelming. We get started on this train of thought, things about beauty and happiness and love and desire, and before you know it, your head is spinning. How do we ground ourselves? Well, I think in this poem moves back and forth between the sort of large meditations of the metaphysical realm and the physical. What is the physical? Well, beginning in the second section, let's say lines 26 or so, in the middle, I have owned to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. And then around line 43, until the breath of this corporal frame and even the motion of our human blood. We're talking about, in this section, nature, sublime, things that could overwhelm the speaker's consciousness by the complexity of these meditations. How do we ground ourselves? In the corporal frame, in the body. I don't know about beauty. I don't understand unhappiness and happiness and all of that sort of thing. But I can understand the things that I touch. My body. I have a beating heart. I have blood. I know myself only, perhaps, insofar as the physicality of my form. The fragility of human experience against nature. Again, this could be recategorized as underneath nature. We have this figure of the hermit. And I think the hermit is an interesting figure. It also shows up in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Something for us to consider. The hermit could be a godlike figure. The hermit could be a symbol of the pastoral figure. The hermit could be the speaker's fantasy of whom he would like to be. What is a hermit? A hermit is somebody who lives off by himself. Now, the problem with that is that sustainable? And I think, more often than not, it's not sustainable. It's a kind of fantasy, right? I mean, in American culture in the 19th century with dime novels and James Fenimore Cooper's, the Leatherstocking Tales, this fantasy of let's get on a horse and go off into the mountains and live by ourselves, and that is going to make us content. What happens when you go off and live by yourself in the mountains all by yourself? You might go crazy. So it's a kind of fantasy, but is that sustainable? But for the speaker who has been away for 5 years, living in the city, this then is his fantasy about being able to stay in this place. And the reality is that he cannot. There's the language that I think invokes Platonic forms. This begins, in the second section, around line 23. These butinous forms. This is Plato's idea that all things have an ideal form, and this is what, in part, the speaker is trying to figure out. The best example of all of these things that he is discussing, do they exist? Do they exist in his experience? So this is a poem about transformations. Does the speaker transform within the space of the poem? I think that there is evidence here to suggest that there is a kind of transformation. The beginning part of the poem seems to be more, even though there's a sense of nostalgia, I don't think we get the sense of forlornness or despair that we get in the second portion of the poem, just to sort of give you an example. I think here there are intersections of Eastern philosophy and Taoism. And I would add to this Christianity, and I think I have this on the next slide coming up. But I think there's some intersections here of Christianity, and certainly at the end of the poem. But let me give us an example here right now, beginning with line 66. And this is the kind of work. I mean, this is a broad overview, but this is the kind of work that I want you to do. Word by word, line by line. Why that word? Why that break in the sentence there and not somewhere else? Why is there punctuation? What is that thing? What does it mean? Let's break it down, and then let's put it back in the broader context to figure out what the speaker here is talking about. Okay, so this example on line 66. Though changed, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded over the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads. Okay, I think a lot going on here, but I want to focus on one particular aspect. That particular moment in the poem seemed to me very much like the language of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it sounded to me like Psalm 114, verse 6. So let me read that again in the poem. Though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded over the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams. So he was like a child that was free, that was unbounded. And if you recall my earlier discussion on romanticism about children, and that they are free and that they are curious and all of that sort of thing. But this particular moment to me sounded like Psalm 114, and let me just read a portion of that. Mountains that you skip like rams, hills like young lambs. So I think there's a really, the word choice that Wordsworth is using at that particular moment, I think, really comes close to paraphrasing and alluding to, if not Psalm 114, then other Psalms and other biblical passages. And what this does is it raises the stakes in all sorts of different ways, whether we're talking about psychology, here we're talking about theology, that this experience, the stakes are very high. This is a matter of life and death. So I want to return to the city just for a moment here, and again, this can be rearranged in all sorts of different ways, but line 138 or 137, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. I think it's interesting that the speaker here is incorporating within the imagery of reconciliation or acceptance, I think, aspects of the city. What is a mansion? Well, we know what a mansion is, and these are the sorts of questions I want you to ask. He says, shall be a mansion for all lovely forms. What is a mansion? A mansion is an expensive home. If you have a job, let's say, in the city, and you work a lot of hours, and you have gotten your advanced degrees, and you are making a lot of money, meaning working for a long time, for a lot of hours every single day, then you may be able to afford a mansion. And so the mansion then is something associated with the city and the fever of the world and something negative, something pejorative, but there's no escape from it. Because now the speaker uses the mansion as a repository within himself of all of these ideal forms. Okay, so poem is a biblical or moral meditation. I explicated just a moment ago where I thought some of the language was very much in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible. And I also wanted to bring our attention to the end of the poem. Let's see here. Just some language for us to look at. Towards the end of the poem, line 153-ish, unwearied in that service, rather say with warmer love, oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love. So words like ecstasy, zeal, holier love, this is the language of theology. And again, what I think this does is it raises the stakes of this poem, that this is not just a walk in the woods, but this is an experience that is really a matter of life and death. Okay, this idea, and I've touched upon this idea of interiority and exteriority. This is not just, and I use this, just spoke about this, we can use the example of the mansion. This is not just a speaker looking out at nature and saying, wow, things are so beautiful. That the elements of nature, the metaphysical meditations that the speaker is making, these are all internalized. And even though the speaker has been absent, this experience is something that you take with you. So even though you're in the rat race and you have to get up and you go to school and you go to work and rinse and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, the speaker says you take this with you. There's the exterior space of the things that you see, and there's the interior space of what these things mean. And even though the speaker cannot stay here forever, even though you as the reader cannot stay here forever, perhaps the best that we can do is take it with us. And then finally here, we can look at this poem in terms of youth, that the speaker begins as a youthful person, a young man, and it moves into maturation and adulthood. And we see this in various perspectives, the energy of the poem, and I want to bring our attention to this idea of expectations of a hopeful future. That things are going to be good, that when you are young, when he was 5 years younger, the speaker had a lot of hope for the future. And now the speaker has returned, more experienced, wise, all of those sorts of things. And if we look at line 10, line 8, let's say. The day has come when I again repose here. I've come back to this space now, here, at this moment, under this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at the season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Even within this pastoral vision, progress is inevitable. What is an orchard? Is orchard created naturally? The answer to that is no. An orchard is a domestication of nature. Somebody has to plant rows of trees. Now, for us, we're going to look at this and say this is, very beautiful. If you have an opportunity to go up north, you can see the orchards of cherries flowering, and then get cherries and cookies with cherries in it, which I happen to like. But that is a domestication of nature. So even within this sort of vision of nature, this pastoral vision, there's domestication and commodification inherent within it. However, it is some beautiful imagery, the mid groves and copses, right? Unripe fruits. Okay. Unripe fruits. What is an unripe fruit? It's a fruit that, okay, I get it. It's a fruit that hasn't become ripe, meaning you can't eat it. But an unripe fruit has potentiality to it. There is the hope of the future. You see an unripe fruit and you say to yourself, I went for a walk the other day and I saw the beginning of raspberries growing. And what do I think to myself? Another couple of weeks and I'm coming back here. I might have to duke it out with the deer and the coyotes and the fox and all sorts of different things, right? But I'm going to come back here and I'm going to get my raspberries because I know in a week or two, good things are coming. Those raspberries will become ripe. So we can consider this poem in terms of the expectations of the future as set in the early imagery of the poem and what happens when the speaker returns. Maybe the potentiality of a hopeful future maybe fails, and that may explain some of his despair or forlornness. Okay, so some questions for us to consider. How do we reconcile these antitheses, these oppositions? Is there a way to do so? Is it just we are forlorn because we have failed to inhabit the space of the hermit, an unrealistic fantasy? Or is this something that we can incorporate in our experience? It's a meditation in the quiet moments of the craziness and the feverishness of living in the city, of living in modernity. How does imagination construct our reality? How do oppositions construct identity? How do they inform meaning in the everyday of life? I think there's a lot at stake in this poem. I think that this is not just a poem that meditates on nature, not just a poem that says, you know what? Yeah, I wish I was young again. I wish I knew then what I knew now. I think there's a greater struggle here, a struggle of identity and reality and all of those sorts of things. Is life the unripe fruit or memory of better lived times? To go back to that example of the raspberries growing down the street, what if I miss my window? And I think that's what the poem here is asking, or the speaker here is deliberating, meditating on. Did he miss his window? Was the unripe fruit, was there a window when he needed to return to get that fruit, that sustenance? Or did he miss it? And because he missed it, it was emblematic of every time in that moment where there was opportunity, it was missed. Whether that's to return or with love or with satisfaction in one's life. And so again, I think the stakes here are quite high. I mean, this is a poem that is struggling, that the speaker struggles to ascertain what I think some of the great questions are that are asked in sacred texts, whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity or Hinduism or Taoism. What is the meaning of life? What is my purpose? How can I live a satisfactory life? Those are questions that I think this poem poses to us. And there's no real reconciliation. There's no satisfactory resolution in this poem. But it's the struggle that the speaker here poses to us. Okay, thank you.